Good evening, everybody, and welcome to History Author Talks. My name is Roger Williams, and this is my first show of the year, so I wish you all a happy new year. And I'm really thrilled to have not one, not two, but three terrific authors with us, and also our partner in history this evening. Just a little bit of housekeeping. I wanted to let you all know that we will be taping this program, so you will be able to share it with all your friends and family after the fact, and that will be on the past episodes tab of historyauthortalks.com. You will also be able to see this people will be able to see this on Facebook Live. I will also be telling you that through the program that you will be able to purchase copies of our authors' books at various websites, normally wherever you buy books, but also during the program, I will be giving you links using the chat feature on where you can purchase the books online. I will also be giving you the websites, the links to our authors' websites throughout the show. And also throughout the show, if you have questions for our authors, I encourage you to send me those questions, again, using the chat feature at the bottom of your screen. And you will be able to send your question. Those questions will come to me. I will then forward them along to our guest host, who I will introduce in a few minutes. And it will be our guest host who will be asking our authors your questions after each of our authors has given their presentation on their book. So with that, I would like to first welcome our partner in history, and that is Jim Smith. And Jim is going to be talking to us and telling us about the Bergen County Historical Society, Bergen County, New Jersey. So with that, I'd like to turn it over to Jim. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Roger, for having me today. It's an absolute pleasure and an honor to be speaking here and helping to talk a little bit about the Bergen County Historical Society to so many of you today. So I have a short slide visual presentation that I think really helps to tell the story of historic Newbridge Landing. So I just want to make sure that the slide is up. Just a thumbs up if you can see the slide. Perfect. Thank you. That's a little bit of my teaching, teaching in Zoom in these days. So the Bergen County Historical Society is formed in 1902 in Bergen County, New Jersey, that northeastern part of our fantastic state, in order to preserve the rich history here in Bergen County. But by the 1920s, still in its infancy, word got out that the historic Zabriskie estate just down the road or up the river on the Hackensack was threatened with being demolished. And so the Bergen County Historical Society worked with the state of New Jersey in order to eventually save and preserve what we know today as the von Steuben House. This house in 1938 was the state of New Jersey invited the society to move into this location. And this is a fantastic 18th century drawing that really gives us a great window into that estate, that we see the traditional house with the Dutch roofline in the background. And in the foreground, the tide mill was constructed. And the tide mill is actually the first structure that's going to be constructed at historic Newbridge Landing, which we call the area today. By 1745, with this prosperous tide mill being erected, a new road is going to be constructed, as well as a bridge. And by 1752, the Zabriskies will construct the eastern section of this house, eventually expanding it to its present size that we see today by 1767. One of the amazing things that when we look at this house, it's going to have a wharf, multiple outbuildings, barns, and an orchard, that the Zabriskis really become very wealthy individuals. So due to that close proximity to New York, you have to really throw into question there why the Zabriskis are going to have such divided loyalties just a few years later. And by November of 1776, this house will bear witness to one of the darkest times in the American Revolution, and that is the retreat from Fort Lee, right? Bergen County is a series of peninsulas. And if Washington, Greene, and his troops aren't able to evacuate Fort Lee and get to that important river crossing, it would have been game over by late November 1776. Obviously, we all know that Washington and his men are able to make that crossing. And yet, during the course of the war, there's over 11 military engagements that occur on this very property. Washington, Lafayette, Cornwallis, Spur, and Hamilton are all at Newbridge Landing, although not at the same time. And then for his service during the war, Baron von Steuben is gifted this very house. And we also know that he's going to invest much money in its upkeep, but eventually will sell it. Today, historic Newbridge Landing is a unique public and private park that's located in the heart of Bergen County. The Bergen County Historical Society is part of the Historic Newbridge Landing Park Commission, which helps to coordinate the different entities that are involved, which is the Society, the state of New Jersey, the county of Bergen, and the surrounding towns. It's made up of both the original von Steuben house, and in 1955, the 1794 Demarest house, which are French Huguenots, was moved to the site, as well as in 1977, the Campbell Christie House was moved here. It was served as an 18th century tavern, and that's the way that we interpret the site today. As well as the Thomas Westervelt barn was moved to the site, which helps to talk about Bergen County's rich agricultural past, which really, Bergen County had a strong agricultural tradition up into the 1950s, which is really hard to believe when we see Bergen County today. The society is made up of multiple committees that offer different outlets for individuals who are passionate about history. We have multiple public events each month. That's changed a little bit in the last 10 months or so. But still, one of the amazing things that's happened over the last few months is that we've also reached out in this digital platform to continue to share the unique stories that are Bergen County and New Jersey as a whole. But also we've seen visitorship and individuals coming to the park has just exploded even during this COVID times, which is amazing to see that there's that great interest in history. And I've seen that in other state parks that I visited throughout New Jersey. Again, New Jersey has so much rich history, and I encourage all of you to get out and explore New Jersey's rich history. And I hopefully encourage you as well to go online, visit our website, find out more information about Bergen County, about Bergen County Historical Society and Historic Newbridge Landing, and make sure to follow us. Follow us on Facebook as well if you're on social media, and you can get all the latest updates and events that are happening at Historic Newbridge Landing. One of the things that I'm very excited and I can announce here tonight as well, that next month we will be launching new interpretive panels throughout the site, that they'll be arriving in February, that will help to improve the visitor experience and help to educate others about so many unique stories that occur in such a small plot of land in one of the densely populated sections of our state. So thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Jim. I just need to step over here and get a piece of paper. So I will, everyone will have to excuse me a little bit. This is my first show of the year, so I'm getting my act together here. Let me just do the spotlight here. Okay. So thank you. And using the chat feature, I did give everybody the link to the Bergen County Historical Society on the using the chat feature. So you will be able to get to their website from there. Now I would like to introduce to you Todd Braisted. Todd is the past president of the Bergen County Historical Society and a fellow of the Company of Military Historians. He has authored numerous articles and books on the American Revolution and has appeared on such shows as PBS's History Detective. His website, royalprovincial.com, is the leading source for Loyalist information. Since 1979, Braisted has amassed and transcribed over 40,000 pages of Loyalist and related materials from the archives and private collections from around the world. So with that, I'd like to introduce you to Todd Braisted.
Thank you so much, Roger. It's a pleasure to be here tonight. So welcome, everyone. I want to thank Jim Smith for joining us as well. As you could imagine, Jim and I are both past presidents of the society, so we have a very strong connection here to Bergen County. We appreciate him being with us this evening. Without further ado, I'd like to introduce our first author for this evening. And we have two, as Roger mentioned. And this is a treat for me, as our first author, by way of full disclosure, has been a colleague and friend of mine for over 40 years now. And I know his current book, Noble Volunteers, is really the culmination of a life's work that I have witnessed firsthand. So I can speak to its just merits, its incredible authenticity. So without further ado, Don N. Hagist is an independent researcher specializing in the demographics and material culture of the British Army and the American Revolution. He maintains a blog about British common soldiers, which is redcoat76 at blogspot.com, and has published a number of articles in academic journals. His books, The Revolution's Last Men, The Soldiers Behind the Photographs, British Soldiers, American War, and others are available from major retailers. He is also the managing editor of Journal of the American Revolution and a frequent contributor of articles to that online publication. And of course, the website for that is allthingsliberty.com, which I cannot recommend strongly enough for all your Revolutionary War needs. Don is an engineering consultant in Rhode Island and also writes for several well-known syndicated and freelance cartoonists. He is a Renaissance man, trust me. So without any further embellishment, Don, the show is yours.
Hey, thank you very much, Todd, and thanks for that very flattering introduction. And for full disclosure myself, as Todd talked about being colleagues for quite a long time now, and we've done a lot of research together. And I have to say that an awful lot of material that's in this book was originally discovered and shared by Todd. He loves to send things to other people who he thinks needs it, and that's just a great way for everybody to do research, to help each other out. He's helped me out more than I could possibly recognize for. Now, I said I wasn't going to share any slides, but I'm going to do so after all. It's really interesting for me to be showing my book along with this other book called Occupied America, because the term occupied tends to make us think about a foreign army that goes to a place and takes over against the will of the people. You know, we think about France being occupied during World War II. But when we think about the American Revolution, it's very important to recognize that many of the British soldiers who fought in America during the Revolutionary War had been in America for years before any war began. And even as tensions grew in America and more soldiers were being sent to North America from England, these soldiers were not coming to America to fight a war. They were coming to try to prevent a war from beginning. And that's a key perspective that I try to echo throughout this book. Noble Volunteers, the British soldiers who fought the American Revolution. Well, the subtitle about British soldiers needs to be kept in mind, because if you want to learn about Lord Cornwallis and General Howe and Thomas Gage and all those big names in the Army, you're not going to find that information here. This book is about common soldiers, the men who served in the ranks. It only talks about officers in terms of how they viewed the enlisted men and what their interactions were, but the real focus is on the common soldiers, the drummers, fifers, corporals, and sergeants. And most of the focus of the book is on infantry because most of the British soldiers who served in America during the Revolutionary War were in fact infantry. There was some cavalry, some artillery as well, but most of the soldiers here were true foot soldiers. The book is also entirely about soldiers in the British regular army. So I don't talk about loyalist soldiers. I don't talk about Indian allies. I don't talk about Germans and Hessian allies. That's all for other books. This one is very narrowly focused, but it's focused on the backbone of the army. And the emphasis in the book is on diversity, not commonality. I see some other books that have titles like The British Soldier in North America. And I can say, wow, well, there wasn't only one, there were a whole lot of different ones. So I try to show the kinds of experiences that many different soldiers were liable to have, rather than just try to look and say, what do all these people have in common? I want to know how they were all different from each other. I'm going to skip over slides here because this is from a longer presentation. So the main title is Noble Volunteers. And I get this question a lot. What do we mean by volunteers here? Well, there were 4 ways that a person could get into the British Army in this time period. You could enlist voluntarily. You could be born into the Army. So your father was a soldier. Now you become a soldier. You could get into the Army as an alternative to prison, or you could get into the Army by being pressed into the Army. I'm going to talk very briefly about each of these things, and I'm going to go in reverse order, and bear in mind that the book goes into all these things in great detail and really explains them top to bottom. Impressment means being forced into the Army against your will, and you'll find a lot of history books that seem to suggest that the majority of British soldiers who fought in America were pressed into the Army. And that's not the least bit true. In fact, it was not legal to press British soldiers into the Army during the second half of the 1750s or in the 1760s or the 1770s. All this time when most of the soldiers who served in America were enlisting in the Army before the war began, and most of the time that they were enlisting when the war was in progress, it wasn't legal for the Army to press men. Oops. It was only legal for a 2-year period out of an 8-year war. And bear in mind that most of the soldiers who fought in America enlisted before the war even started. But even during the war, impressment was only legal for a short period. There were strict rules around it. And what we find is fewer than 1% of the soldiers who fought in the British Army in America were pressed into the Army. So when we think about the Army as a whole, and then we think about impressment, we have to remember that impressment doesn't characterize the Army in any way. Hardly any of the soldiers who fought in America were pressed into the Army. Now, it was also possible to go into the Army as an alternative to prison. A magistrate could look at a man who was charged with a crime and say, well, you can do some years in jail or you can join the Army instead. Well, here too, it was only certain types of crimes. We've got a small list here: bigamy, petty theft, burglary, failure to pay child support. These were not brutal, vicious criminals who were given this opportunity to join the Army, mainly because the Army knew darn well that people who didn't function well as part of society probably weren't going to function well as part of the Army either. But people who had just gotten into minor trouble and needed a new direction in life, they might work out okay. Well, here too, throughout the entire period of the American Revolution, we can document only a few hundred cases of men joining the Army as an alternative to prison. So it was a way you could get into the Army, but hardly any men did compared to the Army as a whole. And it's also important to remember that this was also a voluntary form of enlistment. A man was offered the Army as an alternative to going to prison, but the man could choose whether he wanted to join the Army, and the Army could choose whether they wanted to accept that man. So once again, there's a lot of lore about impressment and about criminals joining the Army, and both of these things did happen but they make up such a tiny portion of the soldiers who served in America that we can't use these two things to characterize the Army as a whole. Men could be born in the Army. It's very hard to find details about this. I talk about it in the book. I'm not going to talk about it very much now. But the important thing here again is, even though we don't know how many soldiers were born in the Army, we can say that this was a pretty good way to get into the Army. So if you're born and raised following your parents from place to place, you're a military brat, basically. By the time you decide to join the Army, you probably have a pretty good understanding of what you're getting into and how the Army works. And in fact, the military writer said, this little nursery can produce some excellent non-commissioned officers. But it was also a voluntary form of enlistment. Just because you were born to a soldier didn't mean you were required to join the Army. Still voluntary. We don't know the numbers. Doesn't seem to be a very large percentage of the total. Well, if most of the men were not impressed, if most of the men were not criminals, most of the men were not born in the Army, where'd they all come from? Well, turns out they enlisted voluntarily. How do you get men to join the Army voluntarily? Well, you use good recruiting language, you use good marketing copy. We've got a picture of a poster on the screen now that says, all gentlemen volunteers who are able and willing to serve His Majesty and who have the courage enough to fight for their country. Okay, that's nice stuff. The 33rd Regiment of Foot took out an ad in the newspaper in 1775 looking for soldiers, and they wrote, any able-bodied young man who is fired with ambition, has a roving disposition, and whose spirit soars above the dull sameness of staying at home. Those men only will be taken who promise to be a credit to their officers and an honor to their country. Oh, this is great stuff. And they're sending this advertisement out to farm laborers and weavers and people who have monotonous jobs and may never have an opportunity to leave their home county. And now they see an ad like this, or they hear a recruiting officer and they say, wow, I'm fired with ambition. I have a roving disposition. I want to go overseas and do cool things. The Army gets people to volunteer by offering them a really adventurous time doing cool stuff. Have you ever seen Army recruiting ads today for our all-volunteer Army? Pretty similar vein that they're talking, right? So they advertise in this way. Here's another recruiting poster, and it's for the 88th Regiment of Foot. I'm not going to read the whole thing. At the top, it says, now is the moment, my noble-minded countrymen. Now is the crisis of our country's fate. And it says, fly to the standard of our sovereign. Down at the bottom, it says, the sons of freedom are alone worthy to support the honor of old England, and the conduct of the noble regiment of British volunteers shall prove that Englishmen never wanted courage to defend their wives, their sweethearts, or their firesides. It's powerful stuff. And out of this recruiting language, I took the Noble Regiment of British Volunteers and came up with the title Noble Volunteers for the book, because maybe not every single man who joined the Army was noble at this time, but most of the men who joined the Army thought of themselves as noble, and they were being pushed to be noble as a reason to join the Army. The British Army that fought in America, almost all the soldiers were volunteers. It's an all-volunteer force of career soldiers, or a mostly volunteer force of mostly career soldiers. And it's really critical to remember that when looking at the lives of these men. They weren't people who joined the Army just to fight this one little war in America. I'm going to look at just a few reasons of why some soldiers enlisted. Unfortunately, very few men actually wrote down what their reasons were for joining the Army. And all throughout the book, I base everything in here on primary sources, and I always rely on the mantra that data tells us what happened, but it doesn't tell us why it happened. So we can look all up and down at a soldier's career, and we could guess why he joined the Army. But if he didn't write down the true reason, I don't want to try to make that guess for him. I'll show you why. Here's a few of the reasons. Now, I can find so far, I've found only 35 soldiers who actually recorded their reason for joining the Army. Not enough to do statistics, but we do see a few trends just among this small number. And I guess they're on the next slide. So I've got one man who said he joined the army because the king's golden guineas in the form of a bounty won my heart. Oh, so you got an enlistment bonus, and he liked that idea. A man joined the 20th Regiment of Foot because he said the fair speeches of the British officers brought us to believe that the army was the best place. Well, you can see that in the recruiting language we just talked about. John Pink joined the 33rd Regiment. He was a tailor. He was working, had a good job, but he was persuaded by a young man belonging to the army that the army was a very advantageous place for a tailor. And he was right about that. Robert Hall joined not from want, but inclination. Another man joined just because he had a wish to become a soldier. Another soldier wrote, I could not resist it, even though I could give no particular reason. And here's another man, he joined to satisfy an inclination strongly bent on rambling. Andrew Scott joined the regiment because it afforded an opportunity of seeing the world. A man joined because his stepmother and he could not agree. Well, that may still be a reason why people join the army, right? Dad remarries, can't get along with the stepmom, looking for another place to go. Jonathan Sawyer joined the 52nd Regiment because he was disappointed in courtship. And James Andrew joined a fencible regiment. It's sort of like a militia regiment that served in Scotland because he wanted to be freed from the clamors of a wife. Well, again, you would probably never be able to deduce these reasons just by looking at the men's careers or looking at the state of employment in their area or things like that. And this is why I don't like to make those guesses. I wish more people did write down their true reasons for joining the army, but this is all we got. I have the book divided into 3 parts. The first part is a peacetime army preparing for war. So it looks at soldiers who were in the army before the war began. And that's a big portion of them. They didn't join the army to go to war. They joined the army and then they were sent to a war. The book talks about their experiences in America as tensions were building. What was it like to be a soldier in a place where the population didn't want soldiers to be? It talks a lot about how soldiers trained to prepare for war, including things like taking target practice and what have you. It talks about how soldiers got exercise and how they were prepared for the kind of stresses that campaigning would bring about. Second part of the book is the largest portion of the book, and it talks about the wartime army, what happened to soldiers in wartime, including in battle. It talks about how soldiers spent time at leisure, how they trained, how the recruiting processes of the army changed throughout the war as the war got bigger and bigger over time. And then the final part of the book talks about what happened at the end of the war when the army didn't need to be as big anymore, so soldiers were discharged. How did soldiers end their careers? What happened to a man after he was discharged from the army? Things like that. Again, the book is very much about individual people. You'll find lots of names of soldiers and the kinds of things that happened to them presented with the backdrop of the broader perspective. How likely was it for a man to become a non-commissioned officer? How were soldiers paid? Was that pay enough? Could you earn extra money over the base pay? All sorts of what I hope are very personal things like that. If you're interested in the book, I encourage it. I'm just running down to one last slide here to put up before I sign off.
Don, you need to share again.
Okay. Oh, that's all right. It's not important to share again. So that's all I have for right now. All I'll ask is that if you do want the book, there's going to be a link about how you can buy a signed copy.
I've sent the link.
Local independent bookstore. Roger will have it up. And otherwise, I encourage you to go to your local museums, your local bookstores, historic sites. These places need us now more than ever. So please, when you do buy books, consider buying it locally. Thank you.
Awesome. Don, thank you so much. That was great. I've been reading Don's book, and it is everything and more than what he just said. So if you want to know about the individual British soldiers themselves, that is the standard that has now been set. So go get yourselves a copy. Want to remind everybody that if you have questions for Don, or conversely have questions for Don, send them to Roger via the chat function, and we'll see if we can hopefully get to them at the end of our next presentation. And without further ado, I've been looking forward to this. Living here in Bergen County is next to one of the areas that was the focus of one of the focuses of our next author's book, Occupied America, British Military Rule and the Experience of Revolution. For those not familiar with Bergen County, it is right next to New York City. Bergen County was larger in the American Revolution than it is now. And it also included two British bases, one in particular, Paulus Hook, modern Jersey City, was part of the British garrison of New York City. So this is going to be quite interesting on a personal level. Our next author is Donald F. Johnson. He's an assistant professor of history at North Dakota State University. Don grew up in the suburbs of Washington, D.C., and gained his love of history from countless childhood visits to historic sites and museums in the area. He earned his BA from St. Mary's College of Maryland, his MA from the University of Delaware's Winterthur program in American Material Culture, and his PhD from Northwestern University. His research and teaching focuses on colonial America and the early republic, and he also teaches courses in NDSU's Public History program. So we welcome Don Johnson to tonight's program. Don, it's all you.
Thank you so much. Good evening, and I want to thank all of you guys for having me. Roger for organizing all of this, Todd and Jim for partnering, and Don for that really interesting talk about a book that I've had on my shelf for about a month. I confess I haven't gotten past the introduction yet, but I plan to. So I want to talk for the next 18-20 minutes or so. And I'm hoping you guys can all see my screen here. No?
Yep.
Oops. There we go.
There you go.
All right. So I want to talk for the next 20 minutes or so about my book, the main arguments in my book, Occupied America, which discusses the everyday experiences of ordinary Americans in the midst of military occupation. And I'm happy to get into kind of my conception of military occupation during the Q&A or elsewhere. Essentially kind of in response to Don's point, that is true that neither side really expected an occupation. But what happened was, something that was quite different than either the army or the civilian populations wanted or knew. So we know that the experience of the American Revolution transformed deeply held beliefs of ordinary people in new and radical ways. And the results of this upheaval are pretty well known, and especially to people in the audience tonight. By 1783, a majority of colonists had come to reject a monarchy that represented the only form of government most of them had ever known. But despite ample attention, historians over the past 2 centuries have paid to the systemic causes, the far-reaching effects, and the political processes of the revolution. How these changes occurred on an individual level remains muddled. Rejection of British imperial authority did not take place only or even primarily in the abstract realm of ideas, nor did it occur solely based on economics, social conditions, military fervor, or cultural affinities. And this is not to say that any of these factors was unimportant, but that it doesn't tell the entire story. Rather, the changes that occurred in the minds and hearts of so many people happened over the course of their everyday lives in highly personal and contingent ways. Most of the men and women living in the North American colonies did not choose to rebel or remain loyal to the crown in an instant or even for a single identifiable reason, but gradually, as lived experiences slowly changed their attitudes towards royal authority. And perhaps nowhere is this more evident than in cities occupied by the British Army. So between 1775 and 1783, every large North American port fell under British rule at one time or another. And the way I define this is that these were kind of occupied first by revolutionary forces when they took power between April of 1775 and roughly kind of March of 76, when they're seizing kind of the accoutrements of power. And then the British come back in pretty much every city but Boston, and militarily assert control over these areas once again. As centers of population and commerce, these cities should have been bastions from which the empire could restore order and inspire loyalty to the crown. But occupation failed utterly to bring about these goals. Survival under harsh material circumstances forced even the most loyal subjects to turn to smuggling, begging, and other illicit means to feed and shelter themselves. Those living in occupied cities learned by necessity to obfuscate their loyalties, taking advantage of the British military's periodic offers of generosity to those who declared themselves loyal, while maintaining ties to the rebel camp as well. The necessity to evade British authority and to preserve allegiances on both sides steadily undermined royal authority as occupations dragged on, and in city after city, by the time the army withdrew most residents, even many who had wholeheartedly supported the crown at the onset of the conflict no longer saw restored royal rule as an option. And what follows is I'm just going to give a couple of fleshed out examples of some of the phenomena that I talk about in more depth in the book. So occupation fundamentally altered the social fabric of American cities. While the army displaced many local elites when it came into town, for others, military rule offered actually new avenues for social advancement, and sometimes in radical ways. An event held in Charleston, South Carolina during the winter of 1782 demonstrates some of these possibilities. And it's a supposition of mine that it's actually held at this mansion, the Miles Bruton House, on King Street in Charleston, South Carolina, which was British military headquarters for the 2-year occupation of the city. On a January night in the besieged city, British officers and newly freed Black women who had been slaves not a year before, participated in a night of revelry, which would have been unthinkable in any other circumstance. The women who 2 years earlier had been the slaves of prominent Charlestonians went out, according to one account, quote, dressed up in taste with the richest silks. At precisely 8 o'clock in the evening, they were escorted by British officers in gilded carriages to, quote, a very capital private house. Again, likely this Miles Bruton House, which still stands, where they proceeded up the steps to a grand Georgian ballroom. There they enjoyed a supper that cost, quote, not less than 80 pounds sterling, before dancing until nearly 4 in the morning. Although instigated and funded by British soldiers, the managers of the ball were 3 former slaves of prominent revolutionary leaders. These women went so far as to assume their mistresses' names on invitations to the levee, signing the cards with the surnames Pinckney, Russell, and Fraser. The event outraged many white onlookers outside of the city, with one correspondent describing it as evidence of, quote, the state of shame and the perfidy of officers of that once great nation. Perhaps to defy their critics, the British officers who organized the event christened it the Ethiopian Ball. Now, the Ethiopian Ball encapsulates the nature of occupation society, both in the strange possibilities it suggests and in the dangers involved in acts of defiance against the existing social order. The Black women who participated in the event had profoundly reinvented themselves. As the British Army moved throughout the South, it offered freedom to enslaved people willing to turn against patriot masters. As these refugees came into occupied cities, they reforged their lives as free people for the first time. Seen in this light, the women who participated in the ball were quite literally taking on new identities. Even if they were still on unequal footing with their officer escorts, they nonetheless used clothing, rituals, and even names to declare their status as free women. Although most did so in less spectacular fashion, thousands of other newly freed people made similar journeys, building new lives for themselves under military rule. Another equally important aspect, however, is the precariousness of this event for both the soldiers and the women who participated in it. Despite their radical refashioning of themselves, the African-American women who participated were in the power of these officers, and even in their fine silks faced the threats of sexual violence and intimidation. Further, the event took place only months after defeat at Yorktown had all but settled British defeat, lending the event a note not only of defiance, but of desperation. The officers who danced the night away with ex-slaves knew that they would soon have to cede the city and possibly the entire continent to the revolutionaries. While the impending withdrawal and defeat might have been damaging for their careers, it threatened ruin for the ex-slaves who took part in the event. Freeing oneself was precarious in the best of circumstances, and many newly freed people saw in the impending British defeat a certain return to the state of bondage that they had so recently escaped. In this light, the Ethiopian ball takes on precarious, unstable notes, which defined military occupation just as much as possibilities for change. Indeed, even for those it benefited, life under military rule was marked by hardships as much as by opportunity. Much of this was brought on by the demands of a large military population that often could not command the resources of a hostile countryside. In Newport, Rhode Island, for example, the British Army nearly doubled the town's pre-war population of about 9,000 residents, adding just over 7,000 men, 600 women, and 500 children to the town and straining the town's resources to a breaking point. And this is a map of the town of Newport from the Revolutionary era. And I know those of you who've been there will know that you can walk across Newport in about a half hour. It's not that big of a place. One British officer recalled that in the midst of a particularly brutal winter, the commandant had been forced to, quote, give orders for the cutting down of almost every tree on Aquidneck Island for fuel, along with tearing down many houses and barns and tearing up even fences. As many as 200 buildings were lost this way over the course of the occupation. When trees, fences, and buildings to burn for fuel ran out, the garrison began sending ships as far away as Long Island to cut timber for the post. Even with these extraordinary measures, the situation was often desperate. During one particularly brutal winter, in December of 1778, several Hessian soldiers died in their unheated guardhouses. Found, as a mid-19th century chronicler colorfully described, quote, standing in their sentry boxes frozen to death, each with a musket standing by his side. That same winter, one resident reported to a friend in Boston that, quote, you may be assured there are many who can scarcely get a single mouthful of bread for several days together. In Newport and elsewhere, even civilians who wholeheartedly supported British rule had to endure shortage and privation, causing many to question their faith in the righteousness of the royal cause. In reaction to the harsh conditions and the violent nature of military rule, men and women living in occupied towns developed distinctly flexible loyalties, much to the frustration of British and revolutionary leaders who vied for their allegiances. In the course of their everyday lives, people living under military rule made pragmatic, calculated decisions to ensure their survival. These choices could tacitly or openly support either side without prejudice. But despite the fluidity of these loyalties, men and women, these people cannot be regarded as mere opportunists. Rather than a selfish expedient, keeping one's loyalties ambiguous represented a deliberate and necessary strategy for survival in the midst of food shortages, cramped quarters, and daily violence. The experiences of Hannah Lawrence, the 19-year-old daughter of a prosperous New York Quaker merchant during the occupation of New York City, reflect some of these flexible loyalties. During the summer of 1779, the young woman came to despise the British forces occupying her city. An aspiring poet, she turned her pen against both the occupiers and those who comforted them. Lawrence found American women who entertained British and loyalist suitors particularly abhorrent, and crafted a strident poem railing against the use of Trinity Church's grounds as a promenade area. And this is a modern day image, or an image of about 7 or 8 years ago, of the churchyard. Trinity Church burned at the beginning of the British occupation, so it was kind of a picturesque ruin that a lot of British officers and their American girlfriends liked to use for kind of romantic strolls during the occupation. Lawrence wrote in one poem, quote, "This is the scene of gay resort. Here vice and folly hold their court. Here all the martial band parade to vanquish some unguarded maid." The piece, left anonymously on the steps of the ruins church, caused a stir among the city, and the young woman followed up 6 months later with another, satirizing the proposed demolition of part of the ruin. One verse joked, quote, "Enlarge the walk to which the fair and shining nightly throngs repair. The female size by hoops increased demands a tomb or two at least." And this is making fun of kind of the hoop dresses worn by the American women. In addition to these, Lawrence crafted poems lamenting the captivity of Continental General Charles Lee, praising the Corsican revolutionary Pasquale Paoli, and castigating New York loyalists who had retreated to England during the city's occupation. So if her poems are to be believed, Hannah Lawrence very clearly supported the Republican cause and loathed the British forces. But a few months after writing her second poem condemning British officers, Lawrence herself marries an American officer serving in the King's Army, a man named Jacob Schieffelin. And despite her earlier strong feelings against the British, she apparently felt few qualms about marrying into the military. And this demonstrates the ambiguities of individual loyalty under occupation. The new Hannah Schieffelin's case in many ways defies our traditional understandings of patriot and loyalist. While she supported the revolutionary cause in the poetry written before her marriage, her personal decisions clearly favored the British. And this flexibility doesn't indicate that she lacked conviction or necessarily even devalue her clearly, thoughtfully considered political ideas. Rather, as her journal entries suggest, this apparent confusion represents a deliberate strategy. Living in an occupied city in which abuse of power, disease, starvation, and death were rampant, very few people could afford to be scrupulous about political affiliation. With few opportunities available to even a well-off young woman living under occupation, choosing a promising marriage represented perhaps her only chance to make the best of the situation. And indeed, Hannah Schieffelin's marriage did allow her the freedom to travel through British military lines and escape occupied New York for the safety of British Canada. But the flexible concept of loyalty to which she and many other Americans adhered reflected the social realities of occupation and the small-scale politics of survival, rather than the rigid political ideologies of revolution we're kind of trained as students to understand. But just as kind of Republican ideology, just as military victories weakened the British Empire's grip on America, so too did these flexible loyalties. And as military rule went on, British officers and officials became more and more aware of Americans' propensity to obscure and deflect their loyalties. And I'll wrap up just with a note on some loyalty oaths. When the British occupied these cities, they distributed thousands of loyalty oaths among the population. For the British Army, these were meant to be indications that people were siding with the crown. But pretty quickly, they found out that people were very often mixing up their loyalties as they went on. In New York, one official complains that, quote, "a man of some rank has a correspondent to the South among the rebels and has arranged to give proper intimation when it will be proper to leave, and so vice versa, making loyalty a sure game." And then a council of military officers concluded in the spring of 1782 that despite the fact that the majority had signed oaths of loyalty to the crown, the inhabitants of Charleston, amounting to 8,000, are mostly of doubtful principles. And so I'll wrap up here, but essentially these doubtful principles, these flexible and ambiguous loyalties, doomed the efforts of the British Army to restore Americans to their allegiance to the crown. Thank you very much, and I welcome any questions.
All right, wonderful. Thank you so much, Don. We do have indeed a number of questions from the audience, and I'd rather try and get to those rather than ask any questions of my own. So we're going to start and try and go in some of the order that they were asked. And one is first off, for Don Johnson. It says, what were some of the military garrisons, supply centers, and naval bases the British used during the American Revolution outside the 13 colonies. You well showed on your map the different cities within the rebellious 13, as it were. But what were some of the others that the British maintained, I'd say particularly here in North America?
So the most important in North America outside of the cities in the 13 colonies was Halifax, which served as a naval base and a source of food and other supplies coming into the country from kind of an uncontested area. There were also several bases in the West Indies that were important to supplying the British Army. But actually, the most important supply port, I think, was located in Ireland, was Cork, where the British Army gathered a lot of its soldiers and a lot of supplies for the army. So those three.
The follow-up question to that from the same person was, what sources would you recommend for further information? I would simply say you need to buy Don's book and look through there. I know it's well sourced and whatnot, and you can find out all you want by that means. So we're going to turn next to our first speaker, Don Hagist. I know I saw a question here for Don, the other Don. Here we are. Were many of the soldiers from Ireland, and where would records about them be found?
Well, the first question is, yes, many of the soldiers were from Ireland. The proportion is tricky to pin down exactly because there's no singular comprehensive source of records about the nationalities of British soldiers. You have to piece information together from a lot of spotty sources, but my estimate would be between 20 and 30% of the British soldiers who served in America were from Ireland, plus or minus a bit. Where could records of those soldiers be found? That's a much more difficult question to answer. I hate to say it this way, but you could buy my book and look at the kind of sources I used and go there. There are two comprehensive sources of information about British soldiers. One is muster rolls of individual regiments, and the other is pension records for soldiers whose army careers lasted long enough and then they were discharged from the army and were able to draw a pension. Those records do give us nationalities. Regimental muster rolls that record the names of individual soldiers who served in regiments do not record nationalities. So it can be challenging, even if you know the name of a soldier, you know the regiment he served in, it's not always easy to figure out what his nationality may have been. And if you're researching an individual soldier and trying to know more about him, an ancestor or what have you, the best thing you can do is contact me and I'll try to help you out with it.
Thank you, Don. We're going to go back to Don Johnson for the next question, and that is coming from Bob Wong. Question: did Quakers sign loyalty oaths to the British after British occupation? If they did not, what happened and how were they treated?
So it varied. In Pennsylvania, a few Quakers did actually sign loyalty oaths. Many others refused. But in Rhode Island, for example, Quakers got together and presented an affirmation to General Sir Henry Clinton, saying that they basically would not resist his control of the island and that they would be peaceable citizens. And generally, the British left them alone. They kind of knew that they were not a military threat, and they generally kind of left the Quaker populations mostly to fend for themselves. It was kind of the revolutionaries who saw the Quakers refusing to sign oaths as much more of a threat.
Thank you. We're going to switch back to the other Don from the same visitor tonight. Were blacks allowed to volunteer for the British Army?
Answer is, for the most part, no. In a few rare individual cases, yes. Now, again, I'm talking strictly initially about the British regular army, the numbered infantry regiments that came from Great Britain, the 5th Regiment of Foot and the 23rd Regiment of Foot and what have you. For the most part, they did not enlist blacks into the army. A few regiments had black drummers and fifers. Now, as the war went on, some of these regiments did engage blacks as pioneers, which were really military laborers. And a large number of blacks were able to join British loyalist regiments. My colleague Todd Braisted is the expert on that topic. So these were regiments that the British Army raised in America of people from America to fight against the American Revolution. And these regiments, for the most part, were raised only for the duration of the war. It was a typical way that British augmented their army in colonial wars, was to raise local people into regiments. So most of the blacks who served in the British Army during the war served in loyalist regiments, not in the British regular army.
Thank you, Don. We got a few more minutes here, and we'll try and get to as many as possible. Back to Mr. Johnson. Our question goes, how did the occupation of, he mentions the areas of West Florida, Pensacola and Natchez, differ from the British and the Spanish?
So the how did the occupation of Natchez differ from the British and the Spanish? Oh, between the British and the Spanish, I see.
Correct.
So the British, it was kind of a hardship duty. I actually have was reading the letters of a loyalist parent who was talking about the prospects of getting their child a commission in the regular British Army, and they say, you know, well, there's one available in Florida, but my son will be dead within 2 weeks if they go down there. So it was really kind of a considered a hardship post among the British because of disease and outbreaks and the climate. It was also used as kind of a prison camp, especially for prisoners taken in the Southern Campaign who couldn't be trusted on parole, were sent down to St. Augustine and interned in British Florida. So it was very much kind of a military camp.
Okay. Question to each of you. We'll go back to Mr. Hagist first. It's the same question, so you'll each get a chance to answer. What were the inspirations for writing your book?
Oh, do I go first?
Yeah, please.
Okay, yeah. Well, for me, I started studying the American Revolution. I studied British military history. I studied military history ever since I was a little kid and learned to read. And I always liked reading factual, personal accounts. I got interested in the American Revolution. And when I wanted to learn more about the American Revolution, the thing that I always found most compelling was the established professional army. For some reason, I just thought it was cool. And at the time of the American Revolution, it was Great Britain that had the established professional army that had all the cool weapons and the cool equipment and the cool uniforms and everything. Just so they had a clearly defined, well-established military system. I found that interesting to learn about. Again, this is, we're talking as a kid here, but you know, the fancy uniforms are compelling. And when I wanted to learn more about the people, though, because I always found most fascinating was to read personal accounts by individuals in military situations, I found that there wasn't much literature on British soldiers, and there weren't many firsthand accounts by British soldiers available. And often the secondary sources that I read said things that seemed contradictory. Like you'd read, on the one hand, discipline was so brutal that men would get beaten within an inch of their lives for the smallest infraction. And then in the same book, 2 paragraphs later, it might say, soldiers were fiercely loyal to their regiments and would go to the end of the earth to follow their commanders and their colors. And I'd say, well, how can both those things be true? And I had the good fortune to stand on the shoulders of many giants and get a lot of good tutelage in how to do archival research, starting as a teenager and going to primary sources to try to find out what's the real story about all this. Well, over time, when you learn a lot about something, eventually you find that you're answering more questions from other people than you can find that people have the answers to. And that's when you know enough about a topic to start writing about it.
Awesome. Don, final word is going to be, Mr. Johnson, the final word is going to be yours.
I'll be quick. I mean, I started this project about almost 11 years ago now, when I was in graduate school, looking for a dissertation topic. And I knew I was interested in I was reading about the American Revolution. I knew it was the period I wanted to study, and that I wanted to look at kind of everyday experience on a kind of granular level. And it was also a period where the American military policy in Iraq and Afghanistan was proving that kind of military occupations broke out kind of and made things extremely complicated, and oftentimes didn't work out the way either civilian populations or the military wanted. And in my reading about the American Revolution, I kind of knew that there was military occupation and there were kind of civilian military conflicts throughout the war, but I hadn't read anything really good on it, so I decided kind of that was a niche that I could fill.
Awesome. Thank you so much. I want to turn this back over to Roger and thank him for the opportunity to host two great authors this evening, as well as our friend Mr. Smith. So Roger, thank you very much.
Well, you probably all, since I was not on mute, you probably heard my grandfather clock banging away behind me, so I apologize for that. I didn't mean to interrupt Don Johnson. Todd, thank you. It was really terrific to have you host this evening's show. I don't think we ever actually mentioned your book, The Grand Forage, 1778, which is another just absolutely terrific book on this topic. So I thank you very, very much. Jim Smith, I thank you for joining us to talk to us about Bergen County Historical Society. And of course, Don Hagist and Don Johnson. I thank you both for terrific presentations on the British side of what happened during the American Revolution. We did not have time for everybody's questions, but if you do go to historyauthortalks.com, you will see that I have links to both our Dons and Todd, and the link for the Bergen County Historical Society on the website. I will be posting the recording of this evening's program tomorrow on the past episodes tab of historyauthortalks.com. And I have not yet booked my next program. Getting 2021 up and running a little slow here, but we will be having future episodes. So if you're not on my mailing list, you can go to historyauthortalks.com, and at the very bottom of the page, if you scroll down, you'll see where you can sign up for news of our next show. But I thank all of you, the audience, who have joined us for History Author Talks. Most of my History Author Talks have been about the American Revolution, but not all of them. We do cover other eras as well, and we hope you spread the word on your Facebook page. But I want to thank you for joining us this evening. I thought this was a great show, and I wish you all a healthy and happy new year. Thank you very much. Good night, everybody.
Thanks, Roger.
You bet.
Thank you, Roger.
Thank you, Roger.
Take care.
Thank you.
Bye.